While there's been mixed reaction to President Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet reshuffle, Ramaphosa announced the changes earlier this week, saying it comes at a time when the country is facing numerous challenges. Meanwhile, Kotongwana has been appointed finance minister. So it's fair to say Kotongwana has a tough task ahead. So let's find out how his economic views will direct our policies. Director at the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule, joins me now for this conversation. Duma, always a pleasure speaking to you. Before we go into the policies that will be spearheaded by one such a now finance minister, Kotongwana, let's speak a little bit about under the cloud at which he's actually taking over this position. He's saying he's ready to move on and be the finance minister of the country. One wonders whether or not South Africa is ready to move on from that 100 million rand scandal in pension funds.
Hi, Faith. I heard, I'm not exactly sure what happened 11 years ago in the issue of the pension funds, but I've heard the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union say that they've put that matter behind them. I think unless there's new information that comes to fore, I think we should all put it behind us for now.
So in putting it behind us, how do we do so and trust in the finance minister's ability to deliver on his mandate?
Well, the people and the union that was affected said that they've reached an agreement with the finance minister, and I don't really know what actually happened in the detail of what happened. So I have to take the word of the union itself as to what happened and how it has been resolved within the union and the finance minister.
Okay, well, let's move on to some of what we know him for. So he's been quite vocal against nationalization, for example, of the central bank. He's been known to actually hold caution when it comes to the issue of expropriation and the likes, obviously looking at economic development as a whole, particularly within the African National Congress as well. So his views and policy views, for that matter, one would say, are not exactly away from what we would expect in the rebuilding of an economy, so to say. So a compliant minister or a minister that might just shake up things a little bit?
Well, if you look at his track record, Faith, he's been described as a conveyor belt for National Treasury. National Treasury has implemented very conservative economic policies over the past 26 years. And especially over the past 13 years, our economy has not performed at all. If you look between December 2009, December 2008, and now 2021, unemployment has soared from 5.9 million people to 11.4 million people. And if you look over the last 6 years or so, our country has not grown in per capita terms. So South Africans on average have become poorer, and our economic policies have not worked. I believe that now the time has come for some changes in economic policy, and it remains to be seen whether the finance minister will make those changes in economic policy. I think the problem here is that the policies that we have pursued over the past 12 years are very outdated and out of sync with what is the mainstream in global economic policy. For example, the central banks in Japan, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Fed Reserve in the US, they've printed $10 trillion since the start of the crisis in March 2020, the beginning of 2020, to support their economies. The International Monetary Fund has urged countries to spend more money and not withdraw the stimulus that they put in last year. The stimulus packages were about $16 trillion last year. And we in South Africa had a completely inadequate response to this crisis compared to what happened in the rest of the world. So I do think that now the finance minister did talk about the need for a paradigm shift in terms of economic policy, but in terms of what is allowed globally, we are lagging behind the policy curve.
Yeah, I mean, talking about lagging behind the global market, one would say that we have to even contend with the realities. So we've got a youth unemployment rate that is sitting well above 70%. We've got a contracted economy. We're sitting with now having to institute economic recovery from the recent riots. So in other words, he's got a real uphill battle if he wants to stabilize matters and at the same time drawing some kind of investor confidence. Now, he's been known to be almost an investor-friendly kind of minister, or while before then minister, but is he able to balance? Because it's going to be a tricky balancing act if we truly are to rise above the occasion of a pandemic as well as a rising unemployment rate.
Well, if you look at the response to the crisis, for example, last year, the stimulus package was only 2.5% of GDP, according to my calculation, and the stimulus that was announced in the budget recently was about 0.6 or 7% of GDP, which is tiny compared to the scale of the crisis that we're facing. So I do think that what we need to do is to have a much bolder, he has to balance the humanitarian response. We need to provide cash to the people who are affected, humanitarian support, as has happened in more than 100 countries in the world, which provided unconditional cash transfers to the people who are affected by the crisis. At the same time, we have to build our economy back. We have to invest more in our economy. The government has only committed 4 billion rands towards its own infrastructure fund. We have to increase the scale of the expanded public works program to talk about the 75% unemployment crisis that we have amongst youth unemployment. I just have to mention that the president, since over the past 3 years, he has announced so many initiatives to address this youth unemployment. You do remember the youth employment scheme. None of them have delivered anything. At some point, the president and the finance minister must say that these policies that we have announced, State of the Nation, all the State of the Nation addresses about youth unemployment, it's time to change policy and develop a new economic policies to get our country out of this worst crisis in more than a century.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the development of new policies, one would say maybe the implementation of some of the policies that we've had. As you're right, we are not exactly lacking when it comes to the development of policies. It's just around the implementation of these policies. So given the track record of one such Enoch Gqubule, I mean, never mind the fact that he was Deputy Minister in Economic Development, of course, he's held various public enterprises as well. He's held a seat there as well. So he's no stranger when it comes to government and the modus operandi of government. Are we expecting implementation from him?
Well, Faith, I would argue it's not so much implementation. It's about you can implement the wrong policies. For example, when the youth employment scheme was announced, within weeks, I said this thing is no way it's going to work, because you can't create youth unemployment in an economy when the government is withdrawing money from the economy through austerity policies. You can only create jobs in a context of more spending in the economy. And if you look at the world economy right now, it's going to grow at 6%. You're looking at the US 7%, China 8.5%, India 9%. Now, the countries that are most successful in rebounding from this crisis are the ones that have spent the most. And we in South Africa are doing the opposite what other countries are doing. We are withdrawing money from our economy through these unprecedented austerity policies.
Yeah. Well, also, he's been at the helm for economic transformation, right? So he's been known by, putting together those policies, particularly within the ANC, of advancing economic transformation. Now, we've not seen enough economic transformation in this country as it is. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that we say economic transformation is going to happen, and then we leave out the significant portion of the market, and that is the masses. Given the state of inequality in the country, is he able to go back into these economic transformation policies and maybe spearhead them so that we can have truly that inclusive growth?
And I think inclusive growth has become a meaningless slogan because it has left behind the majority of South Africans. And when we talk about transforming our economy, we have to transform this economy from a white-owned economy towards one that is owned by the majority of black people in the country. And I've done a lot of work in the whole issue of economic transformation, and it has been a total and utter failure to transform this economy. The government has actually given up on its own economic transformation policies. The black economic empowerment policies have been totally ineffective. According to my calculation, for example, 1.7% of the shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange are owned by black people. And it's actually it's a shame after 27 years and so much effort put into these policies. And we're not achieving anything in terms of structural change, changing the structure of the economy from towards sectors that can create jobs. So we haven't achieved racial or structural transformation of our economy. We haven't achieved any in terms of the gender imbalances in our economy. Across all fronts, we have failed to transform this economy because the government, and I think the government hasn't been serious about this whole policy of economic transformation.
Yeah, I mean, also, can we just shed some light in terms of how do the markets exactly work? So, from what we understand, the rand plummeted by as much as about 2.5% after President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the former finance minister Tito Mbowene's resignation. And then somehow it looked as though it stabilized after he announced his replacement. Why does it appear as though the markets have a little bit of an emotional conundrum to contend with? Why are they so emotional in that regard? How does it all work?
Faith, over many years, I've stopped looking at the rand-dollar exchange rate. If I want to understand what happens to the rand-dollar exchange rate, I have to look what happened to the dollar against the euro. Most of the time, the movements of the rand have got very little to do with the South African economy. They have got to do with what happens outside of South Africa. So I would appeal to many people, South Africans, not to put too much faith or focus of what is happening to our currency because it is not moved mostly by domestic affairs. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously when it comes to the former finance minister, Tito Mboweni, one thing that has been synonymous with him, and maybe even unfairly so, was around austerity measures and how he was implementing an austerity kind of budget and not allowing a more socialist approach. Are we expecting something similar when it comes to this finance minister now, Inokotongan?
Well, as I've said, we really have to change our economic policy because you can't withdraw 265 billion rands, as the government says they will do, and expect anything except economic calamity. The countries that have done well are the ones who have spent their way out of this crisis. And quite frankly, the views of the finance minister were rather extreme because he was saying that we don't have a problem with demand in our economy, when everybody knows that in a recession, by definition, there's too little money chasing too many goods and services. So you have to inject new money into the economy. So I do think that he has to move away from that extreme policies of his predecessor towards something, more to bring more South Africans together, listen to alternative voices, because I think National Treasury has become an institution that doesn't know how to change, doesn't know how to listen to other views, and they must bring in other views in society. And he can become a very good finance minister if he tries to change this institution at National Treasury.
Ooh, at perhaps the risk of upsetting investors, international investors listening to this and going ding, 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 ding. If it becomes too radical, one might be a little bit, feel as though it's risky at this stage. Does that mean that investors will be a little bit more apprehensive in foreign investment in the country?
Well, I was reading an article recently in the Financial Times where they were looking at countries' emerging market debt crisis. And what they said is that countries that have a growth story, the markets don't really look at their debt ratios. For example, countries like India, but countries like South Africa, where they're not convinced that the economy will grow, they're the ones that get punished by international markets. So the key thing is to grow the economy and get out of this crisis. There's no way to reduce our debt ratio without growing our economy. So, and then the other thing, I've been looking at the whole issue of Brazil. Brazil had a higher debt ratio than we did last year, and they implemented unprecedented cash transfers to millions of Brazilians. It was about 4.5% of GDP. The country did well last year compared to all the countries in their region, and now they have recovered to their pre-pandemic level, and their debt ratio is going down because that is the policies. And so those are the type of policies that we should have been implementing.
Duma, Gqubule, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time this evening.